All right, as I mentioned in the first session, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday are all intended to deal with children and parenting and the things that God would, I think, have us to understand about children and parenting. This one deals with children, but from a different perspective. This lesson originally, a version of it, was prepared in a series we did at a marriage retreat, marriage seminar that Ralph Walker and I taught, that was based on Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus talks about a house being built on a rock versus a house being built on the sand. And if you'll recall from that story, both houses apparently were built exactly the same. Same materials used, same quality of workmanship would have been involved, possibly same workers, contracting crew built the houses, whatever the case may be. The only difference was the foundations. And so one lasted because it was built on the foundation, but they both suffered exactly the same wind, the same storms, the same waves crashing against them. One made it through the storm, one did not. And this lesson was actually in a three-part series on assaults on marriage. I renamed it this morning because we revised the lesson a little bit, but also sometimes people don't appreciate children as being called assaults on our marriage, but they in fact are. And so if you think about having children, I just like this idea of tension. The idea of tension, a strain or a stretch, something being stretched tight. And when we're under tension, we understand that, whether it's children or anything. But when we're under tension, we don't normally think as clearly or act as clearly as we would when we're not under tension. If you come home from a bad day at work or a bad day wherever, and your day has been disrupted, and we had 3 toddlers at home. Our 3 were 3.5 years from top to bottom. And so at that time, Judy was working full-time at the home, while I was working full-time at a job, and either one of us might have a day that was highly disruptive in that process. And you come home and you find out there's some tension, a little bit shorter because of what's gone on in our lives. And so we need to break ourselves of certain thought processes, like we said in the last session, that happiness is really the goal. We have to disabuse ourselves of that concept. It's an end product. And the same way, the difference in thinking that children are going to inherently improve a marriage relationship is another idea that we should probably disabuse ourselves of. They're not going to inherently make it better, though they are a gift from God and a reward. God wants us to appreciate that. In Psalm 127, if you want to turn there, a passage that this series is built on the opening line from, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go to late rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. That's so similar to some other things that God says. I love in Psalm 46 when he says, cease striving. Some versions say be still, but I like cease striving better. It's a better description. Cease striving and know that I am God. This passage is saying, look, don't put your efforts forth the wrong way out of your own anxiousness and you thinking you're going to solve the things. If you'll just do what you're supposed to do, that's what we talked about in the last lesson. God will take care of his part, and we need to trust him in that. And then he follows that with, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb, a reward. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. That last section there about arrows in the hands of a warrior is the title of both Monday and Tuesday night. We're looking at 2 halves of that lesson that talk about the implications that are made in that statement. But we think about children as being a gift. And I think, as we would have pointed out last session, the idea that I want my children to understand that marriage works. I was talking to Phil Ford between the 2 sessions here and asked him how long he'd been married. He said 61 years. And I thought, every time I hear that, I was telling him we had a couple who'd been married 69 years when we were in Kansas City before we had moved out of there. And sometimes you feel like I really shouldn't be teaching on marriage. I should just be pointing and say, hey, you want to know if it works? Go there it works. Pointing, 69 years, 61 years, and say, godly marriages will work. But it was interesting because, as Phil indicated, one of the first things that I would always say or be in agreement with, he said, but it requires work. You don't get to 61 years because you just float there. Marriage is not easy. God knows that there is work involved in that. But if I want my children to know that marriage works, that what God has designed makes a difference and can work, and why is that important? Because a recent survey of kids, and I say kids, I mean they were 18 to 24, so young adults, 18 to 24-year-old, 44% of those that were surveyed said marriage is irrelevant. Now, I just want you to think about that. They're not saying, I don't want to get married necessarily. They're saying marriage is irrelevant. It has no place any longer. It doesn't mean anything. God says differently. No question about that. But if you want your children to understand that God's way is correct, then the best thing that you can do for them is to have a marriage the way that God designed it. Let them see a godly husband, a godly wife, so that they can understand. There was a project called School Children and Their Families Project. Went on from 1990 to 2005. 15 years they studied a group of kids, the same kids. 15 years through their time in school, from preschool all the way through graduating out of high school. So they studied these kids for 15 years and determined 92% of those married couples said that there was a gradual increase in conflict after having a child. 92%. They didn't say the marriage was about to fall apart, but they said, yes, there was a gradual increase in conflict. And how do you know that's true? It's interesting, as we do and read surveys that are taken throughout the years, because our culture is so rapidly changing those concepts we understand. So we look at a lot of different surveys and information. One of the questions that is asked is, what are the conflicts about? They ask married couples, what do you find yourself having conflict about? And it's interesting because the top three answers are almost always the top three. Not always in the same order, but they all three make the top three. They just kind of rotate. They deal with finances is one of them. A lot of conflict about finances in marriages. A lot of conflict about the intimate side of the relationship in marriages, and a lot of conflict about children. That's the top three almost every single time a group of people is asked regarding conflict. Why? Because children do bring in tension. They're going to change the relationship. It was interesting, of those that were surveyed, 1 in 4 said that after 18 months their marriage was in some level of distress. Again, they weren't ready to sever the marriage, but they're saying we're finding ourselves arguing a lot more than we should. We're finding ourselves distressed, and that happens. And they determine that it's cumulative, which we would understand. It's a cumulative erosion of the relationship. And why is that? Why is that? Do you ever think about the concept of relationships? In Ephesians chapter 5, I want you to turn back there with me if you would. Ephesians chapter 5, as God talks about this marriage, as he did in Genesis chapter 2 when he established marriage, God talks about the concept of priority in a marriage, in the establishment of a marriage. And in Ephesians chapter 5, in verse 31 again, we read, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, severing of relationships that went this way, parental to child. Now, it doesn't mean they cease to be your parent. What it means is they cease to be the priority relationship. So in other words, and I even have couples, when I do a marriage ceremony, I have the couples turn and face their parents at one part of the ceremony. And I will talk to this particular, the groom or the bride, and say, you realize today you will no longer primarily be the daughter of, and looking at the parents, and I name the parents. Today, you begin to prioritize and be primarily the wife of this man or the husband of this woman. But then I look at the parents and I say, it is important for you to realize that today she is no longer primarily your daughter. Today he is no longer primarily your son. Today she is his wife. He is her husband. I want both the parents and the children to understand that, because the severance part of marriage is sometimes difficult and breaking those ties. But so is this idea of becoming truly one. So in Matthew chapter 19, so important was that when Jesus stated this precept, he said the same thing, but then he said, so therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. He's created a new entity here that he says is absolutely the priority relationship. And so after your relationship with God, your marriage, not your children, have to be your priority relationship. That has to be. Now, are my children important? Absolutely, they are. We'll even see that tomorrow. But they are not to take over the priority relationship of my wife, or for her, of her husband. That has to be primary one. How important is this? You ever think about the relationships that start? Why is tension created? Why do you have issues with this kind of thing? Man marries woman. How many relationships in the household? Sometimes we think one, but there's two. Husband to wife, wife to husband. All right, so think in those terms. Married couple, 2 relationships. 1 child. How many relationships? 6. 2 children. How many relationships? 12. 3 children. How many relationships? 20 separate relationships in one household. Now that includes sibling to sibling and vice versa, parent to sibling, parent to parent. You go through that. There's going to be 20 relationships with 3 children and 2 parents. That's because you have 5 people who all have a relationship with 4 other people. Does the math make sense? But I'm saying, so 20 relationships in a household. You think that's not going to affect things where there used to be 1 or 2 when they got married? It's going to change things dramatically. And so we need to remember that concept, that it has to be the primary relationship. This is interesting. This is a quote I just came across, a few months ago. A marriage or family therapist said this: couples should make their children the center of the home. After all, marriage may not last, but you're a parent forever. You realize how many people there are that read that statement and thought, man, that's a good point. And I'm telling you, that is an awful point. That is an ungodly thought. Marriage is forever. Your children are not. We'll see that tomorrow night if the Lord allows us to. Your children were never intended to forever be that relationship with you as the priority. God had designed something else. And so as we're thinking about how they affect our lives, think of all the things that do change. I mean, they're a gift from the Lord. We're told that in Psalm 127. But the changes are profound. There's changes in so many ways. Identities shift. I am no longer just a husband. I am now a husband and a father. And I need to make sure that husband stays at the top and father comes to the one below that. That's the way God intended and designed. But if we're not careful, we change those relationships that way. The arrival of children automatically is going to provide the understanding that there is less privacy in a relationship. And as children get older, there's even less privacy. You know, when our kids were 1 and 2 and 3, they couldn't get out of bed and come open a door if you didn't want them to. But when they were 8 and 10, things change. We understand that. And so you plan differently. You have to affect things differently in your life. You understand that. I like what one guy put. He put, it isn't just that intimacy has more of a struggle. He said, flirty texts are replaced with messages that read like a grocery receipt. I just like that quote. It's like, you realize things change because you just don't do all the things that you did before. It's interesting in Revelation when God is talking to the church at Ephesus who left their first love. He gave them a way to solve that. He said, remember what you did at the first. So he said, I need you to reflect back. I do that with couples. I meet with couples every single week, every week, different couples. Some live, some Zoom, whatever, but for study, counsel, whatever you want to call that. But I try to get them to understand when they're growing more distant, all right, let's think back to your love story, when this all started, why you decided to get married and all that went with that. That's what he tells the church at Ephesus. He says, you left your first love. I need you to first remember where you were. And then he says what? He says, and then repent that you're not there anymore. In other words, I need to change. He told them, remember, repent, and then he told them, redo. Do the things you did at the first. Start repeating that. Doing that again. Because what we're going to find out is children automatically affect us if we're not careful, and we start dividing our attention in ways that are not helpful. And so whatever or whoever it is, we have to make clear in our minds that the only human being that can have priority, and only one can have priority. Only one. You can stage them down after that, but only one person can have absolutely priority. God understands that, doesn't he? God says, I am unwilling to share you with any other God, does he not? So much that he is described as a jealous God. That's all he means by that. That's not a bad emotion. He's just saying, you can't give part of yourself to me and part to something else. You can't. Marriage is the same way. Only one person can occupy the seat of priority. For me, it needs to be my wife. For her, it needs to be me. And we understand that's not just a recommendation from experience in dealing with couples. That's a command from God. And that's why Jesus said, the two shall become one. You want a picture of how you learn more about God from your marriage, like we talked about this morning? God and Jesus Christ are one. That's what's used to describe them. He desires that we be one with him. He desires that we be one with our spouse. That oneness is an absolute total unity priority position in our lives. So important that, like the way that Jesus, when he would tell stories and describe it, how important is your relationship with God? Jesus said on one occasion, he said, man, you know what? There was a pearl diver. He's constantly searching for pearls, but he was looking for one that was just the great pearl. And he found it. He found this pearl of great price. And what did he do? Sold everything he had that he could buy it. That's a priority. All he was saying was, this one means more to me than everything else I have. I'm willing to give up everything I have for this. That's just the concept of priority. We understand that. Remember, God tells us that. Remember Jesus asking a question? What would you give in exchange for your soul? What could you? He says, I'm willing to give up everything here to keep my soul right with God. He said that's priority. He expects our spouse to be priority with us as well. And so he tells us that we have that priority, that we need to understand what we're raising our children for. I'm not raising my children to spend a lifetime with me. That's not what I'm raising them for. Now, I'm not saying kick them out of the house as soon as you can. But I'm not raising them to spend a lifetime with me. But I did marry my wife with the concept of we are going to be together until death separates us forever in this life. That was the intent of the marriage itself. And so my children can't be in that position of priority. And so I just want to quickly talk about 3 ways that children are budget busters, if you will, this morning. 3 ways that they are budget busters. First, they will bust your time budget. Everything is disrupted in a different way. Every mother understands that. She can remember just a short while ago, before she had children, what good night's rest she used to get. And now all of a sudden that she's up several times. Before I started doing all this teaching on marriage and family, because sometimes, you learn lessons the hard way. Experience helps you learn a lot of lessons. So I operated under the premise there wasn't any point in both of us losing sleep. I thought that was valid. She didn't find that near as valid a point as I did. They're going to bust time budget, but not only there, just in other ways. As we said, intimacy becomes a factor in marriage. And I'm not talking about just intimacy from the standpoint of the relationship physically, but I'm saying intimacy as far as just being able to have time together, to sit down, where our kids had an innate ability. I don't know about your kids. We could not figure out when to eat supper when they were little, before they were eating at the table with us. Because we would say, you know what, let's eat at 5. They'll be down for one of their naps. So at 5 o'clock, we'd fix supper, and the second it hit the table, you got one or more children in the back hollering to be brought back into the room with you. And it got disrupted. So we said, we'll move it to 6. Well, they slept right past 5. They woke up at 6. You think, well, I'll just move it to 7. It didn't matter when we moved it. I guess it was their olfactory glands kicking into gear as food was cooking. You just don't get time together the way that you did. You have children, small children in the house that are you can't just get up and say, we're going to take a walk. Let's take a hike like we used to do. Let's go to the store. Let's go out for dinner. All aspects of time are greatly disrupted. It is important that we understand that you have to make time because you need time. In Ephesians chapter 5, when God is describing the relationship of the husband and the wife, he says, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. That is a sacrificial love that God expects out of both in the relationship. Specifically addressing it to the husband there, but he gives wife commands in the same fashion in regards to how she is to respect her husband, how she is to submit to her husband. So as he's addressing this relationship, what does that mean, sacrifice? It's interesting because women in one of the surveys that was taken were asked, wives, if your husband would give you one thing in life, if that's all you could ask him, I want one thing, what do you think the top answer to that was? Overwhelmingly the top answer to that question, more time. The concept in our world that says you can give quality time instead of quantity time is just not true. There's no such thing as quality time without some quantity involved. You have to spend time with people. Jesus walked day in and day out, spent time with people, listened to them, let them talk, let them explain what they were thinking, the problems that they had. It's no wonder they flocked to him, because Jesus was willing to sacrifice of himself so that they could have what they needed. If I'm going to supply to my wife what she needs, Peter says, honor her. In other words, treat her as the most valuable thing in your life. I need to understand I'm going to have to give time to my wife. I'm going to have to make time because I need it. And so you may not always be able to check out. You may not always be able to go somewhere, but you can check in. You can make sure that you're making contact, that you're sending her a note or sending him a note, that you're sending a text, that you're making a quick call. Whether you're a Stevie Wonder fan or not, I love the words of the song. He says, I just called to say I love you. I just called to say I care. What a great concept that is. I didn't have any other reason. Now, and husbands, I'm going to tell you, are going to wrestle with that more than wives are. We struggle with that. I listened to one guy, I don't know, a few months ago. He said, my wife was talking to me, and she said, you never call me in the middle of the day for no reason. He said, you're welcome. It wasn't a compliment. I need to set time aside. If I can't go somewhere, I understand that. You have 3 kids in the household, you can't just get up and go all the time. But you can check in. You can make sure you say things. You can turn the television off. You can go out and sit on the back porch or sit on the couch or something and just talk. You can spend time together doing something together. Watching TV doesn't necessarily qualify as that, unless maybe you're willing to turn on Hallmark Channel and watch that together. She may consider that time together. Time is necessary. I absolutely have to be willing to dedicate that time. The two are one. And here's what I'm going to show to my spouse. How much she means to me. Because my treasure is where my heart is. My heart is where my treasure is. And that's going to be shown. My wife or your husband will know whether or not you are putting forth extra effort to dedicate the time that is needed to be pleasing to them, to be able to show them the priority that they are in your life. And the reason for that is there are needs that a wife has that only a husband can fill. There are needs that a husband has that only a wife can fill. We need to make sure that we are giving the time. The children also need to see that despite all their needs, they do not monopolize the time. Boundaries need to be set. Secondly, they're going to bust the emotional budget. Energy levels drop when children come on board. There is no question about that. The idea that they cause the conflict, as we said, as one of the top 3 sources, is not new. Arguments over division of labor, who does what, who's taking care of these different responsibilities. One's working outside the home, now the mother's at home having to take care of the children, or maybe she's working outside the home some too. Whatever the case is, children become school age. Oh, the changes, don't they? They erode the quality of a couple's connection if we're not careful. It's important that they understand that they aren't the driving force. It is critical to stay connected emotionally. To God, couples need to pray. Couples need to study. Talk about the Word of God and stay connected to God. That is critical. If my emotions are going to be what they need to be, I need to spend as much time as I can listening to what God has to say and then pouring my heart out before Him. Will it always be good things I'm pouring out? No, I love Job. I don't know how much you like Job, but I like Job because Job was willing to get on his knees before God and say, I'm confused, God. I don't understand. I don't understand why this is happening. I'm not telling you don't have a right for this to be happening. He never accused God of not having a right to do it. He said, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. And yet God says Job didn't sin. And all these things, he did not sin with his mouth. But he still looked at God and said, I think you've got it wrong. I think you're mistaken here. I'm not the man you think I am. We need to reevaluate this. On one occasion, he says to, I want you to imagine this. On one occasion, he says to God, I would that you would come down here, like in a court of law, and I could make my appeal before you face to face. I'm telling you, that's a man who is in great distress, but willing to pour his heart out before God. Don't be ashamed to let God know how confused you are by the things that your children have brought into your life and the stress that it causes. Don't be ashamed to tell each other, to stay emotionally connected to each other. I have couples that I counsel with when they're struggling especially. I say, here's the way I want you to start the day when, if both of you work away from the home, when you both get home, or if one works away and the one gets home, here's the way I want you to start the evening every day. I want you to come in and I want you to tell your spouse what kind of day you had by a number system. You ever been in the hospital and they got that little chart? Which doesn't go, the last one looks sad, it should be screaming. If the pain's 10, it ought to be a screaming face or something. But they're asking you, but because the nurse will come in and say, where are you on the chart? Oh, I'm only a 3. They're thinking, well, that's good. We'd expect it to be a 3 at this stage. That's good. If you say you're an 8, they're going to look for something to give you to medicate you. So you're helping them understand. So I tell couples, emotionally, walk in the house and say, I had a 2 out of 10 day. So your spouse will know you're probably already in a little bit of a mood. You're a little distraught. They know how to deal with you, but you're letting them know where you are emotionally. Husbands really wrestle with that again. I know as husbands, fine is the answer to everything, or nothing. How are you? Fine. What are you thinking about? Nothing. We solve both things with 2 single words. You need to stay connected with each other. You need to stay connected with God. You need to make sure that God is the driving force and that the 2 of you together are sharing in God. Jesus in John chapter 17, as we said before, said that he and the Father are one. Have you ever had this experience? I have. Years after you're married, your spouse says something to you, and you say, I never knew you felt that way. I never knew you liked that. I never knew you didn't like that. Maybe we should have had more conversations beforehand, if I'm going to truly know. But children will interrupt that and that budget. Hold each other accountable. Be willing to help each other be emotionally bound. I need you to open up. I need you to share. I need to know how the kids are affecting. Let's go to God and talk to him about how these kids are affecting us. And then finally, a financial budget. Your child's involvement is going to affect all 3 budgets. Isn't it interesting that intimacy and financial are 2 of the sources of conflict over and over again in marriage, and the third is children, and the children are involved in all 3. They affect the intimacy, they affect the finances, they affect that emotional structure, all of that. And we need to understand that. Just having children affects this. We have a son in Lexington now, used to be in Bowling Green. They have Ben is 9, is that right? So they have a 9-year-old and 4-year-old triplets. I didn't know that the country had that many diapers, and they've got them all in their household now. They had, when they throw showers that are called diaper showers, I'm thinking that's just ludicrous. They can't buy their own diapers, and then you see the mounds of diapers it takes for triplets, and you understand. Financially, you realize what a hit that is on kids? The things that you need to do to feed them, and I told them, you haven't seen nothing yet. Wait till you got triplets. Wait till you've got teenagers that are triplets. 15-year-old triplets. They'll eat you out of house and home. We understand that. We used to hide food. Did you ever do that? Dole it out. I'm not putting a pack of Oreos in the pantry, because if they get it out, they'll eat the entire pack between our 3 teenage boys. No. Did you have Oreos today? No. Well, then here's your 2. You can have 2. Dole it out. I couldn't possibly have afforded to feed them the way they wanted to eat. That's all I'm saying. They didn't need that. We understand financially they have a gigantic effect, but they need to understand that budgets work. They need to understand that they need to follow a budget, because they're going to involve every aspect of our lives. And I can just tell you, with Christians today, one of the things we need to learn to understand, when we had our 3 boys and they were young, little league age, so 12 to 9 at that stage, that was all in one little league. We were in Temple Terrace, Florida. 9 to 12 years old. Our boys played a 52-game season. That meant you had practice every week and a game every week. Sometimes 2 games in a week, because there were a month and 2 parts of the season that there was no games. But I'm saying, and they're not playing on the same team, because one's 9, one's 10 and a half, and one's 12. How does that work? I can tell you how it works. You may as well just pack up a motorhome and move to the ball field, because you're not going anywhere else. The amount of time. And then my son, they had a child that played travel ball. I thought we were using a lot of time. They played travel ball. They're driving everywhere. I think it's important to understand this. Your children do not need to play 4 sports, be in drama, be involved in band or chorus and every other thing that is available to them. You are not helping them. You are not helping yourself if your children are overcommitted, which makes you overcommitted. Because God says we have to make this the priority. And if my children's involvement in school things is taking 25, 30 hours a week of my time, this will suffer. And how do you know that? Look up gray divorce. That's a concept that didn't even exist a few years ago, a phrase that didn't exist. Gray divorce. That is marriages that are getting separating and divorcing after about 25 years of marriage, which is when the children are now gone from the home. Empty nest divorces. And of those that do that, 39% surveyed said the only reason they got divorced was because they had grown apart from each other. I'm telling you, you will suffer. Your marriage will suffer. You won't have, if all you can talk about is the kids right now, because you have kids, you need to change that. Don't let them take all your time. Don't let them take all your finances. For us, it was important to learn to change our verbiage with the kids. Understanding that we made choices, not because we had to, but because we chose to. And so I changed a phrase that I use, and I encourage other couples to do it. Our children would say something like, "Dad, can we buy this?" And my typical response was, "No, we can't." But actually, that wasn't true. We could have. "Dad, can we go to Disney World?" We lived in Florida. You know, it's like an hour and a half drive. "Can we go to Disney World this weekend?" "No, we can't." I eventually changed that because I thought it's important for them to learn something. So they would say, "Dad, can we buy this, or can we go do this?" I'd say, "We can," you know, which they lighten up. They're excited now. I said, "But we're not going to, because we have other choices that we need to make that are priorities. And some of the money that we have, that we could buy that with, or that we could go there, God said He gave me in Ephesians chapter 4, He gave me the job that I have that provides for my family and gives me an abundance so that I can help somebody else who doesn't have that." Help your children understand that money that is given to you by God, you are a steward of, the same as the time that He gave you to be a steward of. And I need to use it in the right way. And I would tell you the hardest thing in life is to achieve balance, not just with kids, but in all areas. If you're not there right now, think about John Trent's book, which is called The 2-Degree Difference. Just make a little change and start moving the right direction. You'll get there. But make the change. Get the right direction. Get marriage and family back in balance. It's a tough balancing act, but the only way it works is spouse first, children second, after God. God, spouse, children. He said that's the way we balance it. Then tomorrow, Lord willing, we'll start talking about, so what's He want you to do with these children? Because He has a plan for them, just like He has a plan for us. Thank you so much for your attention this morning.
Wayne Long.
Wayne?
We run into each other around the country a time or two.
A time or two.
It's good to
Well, I appreciate you saying that.